Oh God! Sally's heart dropped as she heard her beloved husband, Harry, groaning in agony from the bedroom. Despite the searing pain he was enduring, Harry refused to let his weakness show, determined to be strong for Sally, who was already shouldering so much of the burden. For 2 long years, Harry had been confined to his bed, unable to stand on his own 2 feet. Despite the immense difficulty, Sally never once entertained the idea of giving up on Harry and sending him to a hospice. She was committed to staying by his side and supporting him through every step of the way. People around them supported the couple as much as they could with words and hugs. Despite the difficult circumstances, they found solace in the kindness of those around them. And then there was Rhonda, the persistent friend who never failed to offer her unsolicited advice and opinions. This time, her approach was sudden and surprising. "Sally, I know it's none of my business, but you're going to hurt yourself. Why do you have to go through this? You're pretty and still so very young." "Think about that," Rhonda said to her one day. "What are you talking about, Rhonda? I expected you to say something nicer than that." Sally was disappointed in her close friend. Sally was still young and had a lot of potential for a fulfilling future, but her prospects were now darkened by Harry's devastating illness. The burden of the situation was overwhelming, causing her to weep as she was filled with emotions. The sadness in her eyes reflected the intense love she had for her husband and the pain she felt at witnessing his suffering. As Sally cooked breakfast, she couldn't help but think back to the beginning of their love story. 10 years prior, as a young student on the brink of graduation, she had fallen deeply in love with her philosophy professor. He was 23 years her senior, but with his smooth, velvety voice and eloquent words, he had captivated her completely. Sally was just one of many young women charmed by the professor's charisma, but for her, he held a special place in her heart. The love she felt for him was all-consuming, and in that moment, nothing else in the world seemed to matter. Sally came from a wealthy but small family, consisting only of her and her mother, Mrs. Gardner. Sadly, her grandparents had passed away years ago. The infertility of Sally's grandmother, Mrs. Foyle, was the root cause of the small family. Mrs. Foyle was only able to conceive at the age of 45, unlike Sally's mother, who had given birth to Sally at the age of 30. Sally's father was somewhere out in the world, having chosen to run away when he learned of Sally's mother's pregnancy. He was not interested in starting a family and only wanted to have a relationship with Mrs. Gardner with no strings attached. He was 10 years older than her, but when faced with the prospect of fatherhood, he chose to flee instead of stepping up and accepting his responsibilities. Mrs. Gardner chose not to pursue him, realizing that it would be better for Sally to grow up without a father who was not willing to be a responsible and loving parent. She made the difficult but selfless decision to raise Sally on her own, putting her daughter's well-being above her own desire for a complete family. Despite the challenges of raising a child on her own, Mrs. Gardner was determined to be an independent woman and provide for Sally. However, she soon found out that raising a child was not as easy as it seemed, and she was grateful for the support of her wealthy parents. They were always ready to help, assuring Mrs. Gardner that they could handle many things and assist in raising their granddaughter Sally. Sally's grandfather, Mr. Foyle, was a self-made man who had built his own wealth from the ground up. At the young age of 16, he left his hometown and journeyed to the city in pursuit of his dreams. He took on odd jobs, the crucial one being cleaning windows on tall buildings. That's how he would meet wealthy individuals and learn from them. With his determination and entrepreneurial spirit, Mr. Foyle was able to build a successful construction business and become a millionaire by the age of 25. Thanks to his success, the family was financially secure and did not have to worry about financial struggles. Hurt by the betrayal of the man she loved, Mrs. Gardner found it difficult to trust and love again. She saw only negativity and selfishness in men and felt no need for their attention. Instead, she poured all of her energy and love into raising her daughter, Sally. Mrs. Gardner was immensely proud of her daughter, who brought joy to her life with her many talents and loving nature. Sally was truly one of a kind and brought happiness and fulfillment to her mother's life. Sally excelled in school and was particularly gifted in the arts. After high school, she went on to study interior design in university, where she eventually landed a prestigious job at a design company in Europe. Her coworkers and colleagues recognized her talent and saw a bright future ahead of her if she continued to develop her skills and work hard at the company. But for some reason, Sally decided to pursue her master's degree. When Sally turned 20, the sudden loss of her grandparents within just a week was a big shock for her. and Mrs. Gardner. They had not only lost their parents, but also the source of love, comfort, and support in their lives. Mrs. Gardner especially took the loss of her parents to heart, as she had been very close to them. They used to share everything with each other and would often talk for hours. Often, they would talk for hours on end. In their absence, the once lively and loving big house became quiet and somber. The memories of them were scattered everywhere, and it felt as though they were still present, but their physical presence was greatly missed. But to make matters worse, the relationship between mother and daughter deteriorated during this time. It all began when Sally returned to school to pursue her master's degree. She fell in love with her professor, who was in his late 50s. Mrs. Gardner was not pleased with the direction of the relationship. When Sally introduced her boyfriend to her mother, Mrs. Gardner was taken aback by his age. He was nearly the same age as her. Despite his reputation as a well-respected professor, Mrs. Gardner saw right through him and was unimpressed by the relationship. The relationship between mother and daughter only worsened. Mrs. Gardner was not the one in love with Magnus, which allowed her to objectively assess the situation. She drew from her own past experience with a similar man to warn Sally about the dangers of rushing into a relationship. Despite her mother's warnings, Sally was determined to ignore any warning signs and red flags. Mrs. Gardner felt helpless as she tried to explain to her daughter that her feelings were likely just temporary, and that it takes time to truly get to know someone. However, Sally remained resolute in her feelings and refused to listen to her mother's advice. In an effort to protect her daughter, Mrs. Gardner took matters into her own hands and launched an investigation into the professor's background. With the help of her influential friends in Europe, she uncovered disturbing details about the man who was supposedly going to be her son-in-law. It was revealed that the professor had a history of seducing young students. He carefully selected his victims, usually attractive and talented young women who were struggling with their studies. Mrs. Gardner's investigation also uncovered evidence of the professor's financial instability, as she discovered several loans under his name that were consistently overdue. At first, she tried to talk to her daughter and express her concerns, but Sally was stubborn and refused to listen. Mrs. Gardner was eventually forced to take a more direct approach and demand that Sally end her relationship with the professor. She believed that the older man was only using her daughter for monetary gain, given her family's wealth. This led to numerous confrontations between the two generations, each one becoming increasingly heated. "How can you not understand, Sally?" Mrs. Gardner would say. "He's going to use you, and then when he's taken what he wants, he'll get rid of you. I've seen people like him before." They both knew that Sally was born as a result of a relationship that wasn't going anywhere. However, Mrs. Gardner believed that in their case, they were young and naive. This was different, as the professor was a man who deliberately targeted young and wealthy women, using them for his own gain and then discarding them once he was done. Sally wanted Magnus to meet her mother again, despite Mrs. Gardner's warnings. Magnus put on a show of being a romantic man who had finally found his soulmate. However, as soon as he realized how wealthy they actually were, he saw an even bigger opportunity. At the time, Magnus was staying in a university-provided apartment because the bank had taken his own. He was now picturing how he'd pay off all his debts. His main goal was to create a rift between Sally and her mother and to split their fortune. Sadly, part of his plan worked, and the relationship between Sally and her mother became increasingly strained. After a few days of staying with Sally and Mrs. Gardner, Magnus left the house early in the morning, leaving behind a note on Sally's bedside table. The note read that it was either him or her mother. The situation was devastating for Sally, who was torn between her love for Magnus and her loyalty to her mother. The raindrops fell heavily on the ground, matching the somber mood of the situation. Sally was leaving, and Mrs. Gardner could do nothing to stop her. Despite her efforts to protect her daughter, Sally had made up her mind to be with Magnus. Before coming to meet Mrs. Gardner, Magnus had been manipulating Sally, trying to convince her to take her life into her own hands and not be dependent on her mother. He told her that she deserved half of the fortune. However, when Sally showed up at Magnus's door with just her suitcase, he knew his plan was over. "Are you nuts? What did you say to your mother?" he exclaimed. "I thought you would come with at least half of the fortune. I think this whole thing was a big mistake, and I feel like I don't love you anymore, Sally. I'm sorry, but we can't be together. What are you talking about?" Sally was shocked and hurt. She realized that Magnus never truly loved her, but only saw her as a means to an end. This story is a testament to the power of infatuation and how it can cloud a person's judgment. She gathered her strength and replied, "I thought love was about supporting each other and facing life's challenges together, not about money. I'm so sorry, Sally." And just like that, Magnus shut the door in front of her. A moment later, a stream of tears began flowing from her eyes. She stood there for several minutes, not knowing what to do next. Then she picked up her suitcase and slowly wandered away. She thought hard about everything she had done wrong, how she didn't listen to her dear mom, how she ended up being scammed, out that she was all alone. She had to figure out her own way. For now, she thought she needed to find a job. Soon, she realized that all the stress and anxiety had made her feel so insecure that she couldn't find a job. She couldn't find a decent job for her qualifications. There was one job at a school. They'd been looking for an arts teacher. The school was located in an inner city, had limited funding, and mainly served students from underprivileged backgrounds. The pay was low and not many people were willing to take on the job. A young teacher faced a challenging time as the students continually teased and even attempted to harass her. Despite the difficulties, Sally showed resilience and stood her ground, expertly handling any insults or difficult situations thrown her way. But to her colleagues' surprise, she was able to maintain her composure and assert herself as a competent authority figure. Eventually, something unexpected happened that led to her meeting Harry. Harry worked as a system administrator at the school and was fortunate enough to not have to deal with troublesome students. He tried to avoid confrontations with the difficult teenagers. He was thin and wore glasses, making him an easy target for bullies. He secretly liked Sally, but was too shy and lacked the confidence to approach her. For now, he remained a spectator until one day. Despite his nervousness, Harry mustered up the courage to approach Sally one day. He waited for her to exit the building, but to his surprise, she was accompanied by a group of teenagers who were harassing her. Harry quickly walked behind the corner. He was too shy to call out to her, feeling that someone as beautiful as Sally would not take notice of someone like him. The teenagers were much bolder and continued to insult her. Harry, hesitant about his next move, decided just to follow them. As they walked around the corner, the leader of the group, Liam, said to Sally, "Let's talk now." "But you're too confident in the classroom." Along with two other classmates, Liam pounced on Sally, and they suddenly started pulling her into an alleyway. They were out of control, seemingly under the influence of some kind of substance. Sally desperately cried out for help as she was being dragged down the alleyway. Just when she thought all hope was lost, a thin young man appeared from the other end of the alleyway. She recognized him as a geek from the school, and he was armed with a stick. Harry confronted the bullies and demanded that they leave her alone. The bullies greeted Harry's arrival with mocking laughter and quickly turned their attention to him. The situation was about to turn into a double attack, but Sally took action that she never thought she was capable of. She grabbed a brick from the ground and swung it at Liam, hitting him on the shoulder. The blow was hard enough that Liam immediately retreated and raised his hands in surrender. Then she started screaming at them hysterically, like a wounded dog. The other two bullies stopped their attack and fled the scene, but they did manage to jump on Harry on the way and beat him up. Harry was left badly injured and spent a week recovering. Sally checked up on him the whole week. After the attack, the teenagers were reported, and they were expected to be sent to juvenile detention. This event had a significant impact on the school, as the rest of the students began to show more respect towards the young teacher. After all, she dealt with one of the most difficult kids of the school. From that point on, no student dared to misbehave in her class. Harry and Sally became close friends over the years, but Harry never dared to reveal the deeper feelings he had for her. He was afraid that confessing his love would lead to rejection and the end of their friendship, and he couldn't bear the thought of never hearing Sally's cheerful laughter again. When Harry finally confessed his love to Sally, she was overjoyed. She had been secretly in love with him too, but was also afraid of ruining their friendship. From that moment on, they started a new chapter in their lives and became a happy couple. Harry was the complete opposite of Sally's previous love. He was willing to sacrifice his life for Sally's happiness. They had a wonderful time together and even planned to start a family. However, tragedy struck. Harry woke up one day with a really bad headache. When he got up, he couldn't stand on his feet. It was the unhealed hematoma from his injury. The doctors gave him a grim prognosis and informed him that he wouldn't have much time left to live. The only hope they had was a costly procedure at a clinic, which they couldn't afford. Billy considered asking her mother for help, But her mother had sold her home and disappeared without a trace, wanting to leave her past behind. Sally had to leave school to take care of Harry, but they needed some kind of income. She looked for a part-time job and found one. A wealthy household needed a cleaner. She was happy they hired her, even though the residents appeared to be haughty and harsh towards her. But Sally didn't care about the way she was treated as long as she was getting paid weekly. While cleaning the house, she noticed a framed portrait on the wall and couldn't believe her eyes. It was her childhood photo. She was overwhelmed by memories, but confused as to why her portrait was in this house. The owner said that they had recently purchased the house, and the previous owners must have forgotten to take it. It didn't seem suspicious to Sally. She figured her mother must have lived in this house, and when she moved out, she left the portrait. Sally thought her mother probably left it there on purpose since she was upset with her. Her heart ached at the moment. She really wished she could visit her mother and give her a hug. But after all that happened, she was afraid her mom would not let her near her. But she was wrong. The owners left the house and asked Sally to just clean up downstairs and ignore the upstairs. They said their mentally ill sister had been living with them, and she had been going through a difficult time. Allie thought it was even better for her as she wouldn't have to do much work. While she was dusting the TV stand in the hallway, she heard a low moan from upstairs. She stopped and listened. The moaning continued, and she realized it was coming from the mentally ill sister, or full of pain. As much as Sally wanted to mind her own business, it was difficult to ignore the moaning. She was familiar with this type of moaning as it indicated that the person was in severe pain. When Harry had headaches, he would moan like that. She couldn't take it anymore and went upstairs. She slowly approached the door and noticed the key in the lock. The whole situation was becoming more suspicious. She wondered why the door was locked from the outside. Something wasn't right. Eventually, Sally summoned all of her courage and opened the door silently. To her shock, she found her mother lying on the bed inside. She looked like she'd been tortured. There were dark circles around her eyes, and her lips indicated she was dehydrated. She was lay on the bed with her eyes closed. When Sally entered, her mother opened her eyes but was looking off to the side. Sally realized her mother couldn't see. She slowly approached her mother and spoke to her. When her mother recognized Sally's voice, they both hugged and cried. The couple was arrested upon their return. Sally was stunned when her mother told the whole story. Bridget showed up one day claiming she was her half-sister. As it turned out, Sally's grandfather made a mistake when he was younger by giving in to a momentary attraction, which he regretted for the rest of his life. As a result, an illegitimate daughter was born. Bridget, Mrs. Gardner's half-sister, was a troubled woman who had been in and out of prison many times. Bridget had never known that her father was a wealthy man. However, after her mother's death, she discovered unsent letters from her mother which revealed the truth to her. She and her husband then searched for her half-sister and demanded that she share the inheritance with them. Surprisingly, Mrs. Gardner agreed to do that, but only on the condition that Bridget take a DNA test. Since the criminals thought the DNA test was too risky for their identities, they devised a plan to steal the inheritance. They poisoned and paralyzed Sally's mother as part of their strategy to steal her house. Fortunately, Sally disrupted their plans, preventing them from achieving their goal. Neither Sally nor her mother could have imagined that they would reunite under such distressing circumstances, but their meeting had a lasting impact on their lives. Despite only a few months passing, happiness has been restored to their family. Harry made a full recovery after receiving treatment at an expensive clinic. Mrs. Gardner also fully recovered from the poisoning. Sally apologized and asked her forgiveness. She learned some important lessons, and the most significant one was her association with the professor. However, if it wasn't for the professor, she would never have met Harry, and now she was expecting a child with him. Sally happily shared the news with everyone. When Harry and Mrs. Gardner heard the news, they were overjoyed and celebrated. Sally continued working as an art teacher. At school, she was one of the most energetic teachers, so she was finally happy. It's about the teenagers who were going to spend time in juvenile detention. After all, they were just kids. In fact, if it weren't for them, Harry would never have gotten sick, and she wouldn't have saved her mother. Therefore, even though she was the victim of assault, she was planning to ask the judges to be lenient. Harry and Sally decided to devote their time to working with the difficult kids at school and helping them make the right choices.